Could I call on our contributors to our new issue, the Bangladesh paradox, to release the issue before we start our discussions? Just stand up and open the back. Akshate, synchronized. Hold it up. Thank you very much. Can I start by thanking the organizers? It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here to launch our special issue on Bangladesh. For those who don't know, Himal Southasian is the only regional magazine looking at all of South Asia. Bringing out this special issue is because we feel Bangladesh does not get the attention that it deserves. And there is so much of critical relevance here, not just the negative news. And that is why we felt we wanted to bring out this special issue. We had actually planned this special issue quite a long time ago, but we are based in Nepal, and the big earthquake of April and May delayed the issue. But by a happy coincidence, we published it just during the literary festival. Could I start by asking Afsan perhaps to comment on why a country of this size, relevance, and the role it plays in the region on many critical issues does not get the attention that it should have, globally and regionally?
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. First, thank you, Aunohita. I'm one of those who is one of the members of the editorial board. So the Himal Southasian, led by Mr. Kanak Dixit, is a great dream. And we are slightly unwilling, but happy travelers on this great journey to produce something like a South Asian publication. And Kanak is very happy that Aunohita looks after the magazine, which is what he was telling me when I last met him. So here's an opportunity to publicly thank you. I have always been in favor of shutting it down. Okay. The question about why we don't get enough attention and why others perhaps get more attention depends on who is paying attention. If you have been looking at international sites, and I do, I follow international media, you will see Bangladesh is getting a huge amount of attention. And of course, that's because there have been some killing. Killing is, as a journalist, and I think, oh, my mic failed. Yeah. Okay. As a journalist, I know how wonderful it is to hear that somebody has been killed. I'm making an honest confession. That is news. I'm going to sell it. I'm going to bring it to attention. So even today, yesterday, the priest who was hit is BBC page 1. So we will keep on continuing this, because who are you addressing these issues to? You're addressing to an audience which is already very scared of the rest of the world. So we don't get enough attention about our development programs unless they follow a kind of a Western paradigm, or we do not get attention unless they are about something which scares the West. So in 2006, when I produced a documentary on climate change, I did not get any attention in Bangladesh. I've been working on climate change from 1990, and I never got any attention, mainly because people said, oh, this is not good. But once I put in terrorism as the inevitable contingent impact of climate change, I immediately I have been on National Public Radio, I have been to all the major Western institutions, I have taught at universities, I have been a fellow at Oxford. I've done everything because the word terrorism dominates the Western mind at a level we do not even understand or comprehend. We have lived with terrorism. and we do not experience any disturbance in our life like the way terrorism does. So what does terrorism imply to the West? It implies a breaking down of the order that has already become very fragile since World War II. And these are additional pressures. So where can we say we have achieved? I'm like Prashanta, I teach at Brack University, so we can go on. So I'll tell you what, I look at history and the subject I taught yesterday, which was famine. And I look at the number of people killed in famine. I don't know how many of you know, in 1770, 10 million Bengalis died in a famine, literally killed. And nobody, my students even don't know that 10 million died. Now, if you took the number of people, this is a very unseemly comparison, but Holocaust had a lesser number of deaths. The moment Holocaust was going on, 3 million Bengalis were killed because the British government decided not to send the food ships to Bengal. So we have been killed regularly, but it doesn't draw attention unless the gun goes off. Now when there is 130 million terrible deaths in Paris, takes away all the attention, but we will not get attention unless we do something comparable. Now, as a journalist, I'll give you one anecdote. When I was a BBC correspondent, I got a call from London and saying, look, Afsan, what is happening in Dhaka? And I said, nothing is happening. Only the Prime Minister has said she will arrest all those who are against her and in favor of corruption. Half an hour later, the call comes, Afsan, that is a very serious news. So I said, what? Very slow day in Bush House. He said, yes, please make us a news. So international media's perception of news has very little to do what internal achievements are. But what has happened, our ruling class is totally dependent on perceptions in the West about how we are doing. We do not have our own indicators to measure whether we are successful or we are not successful. So take climate change, because that's been a subject I have I'm a journalist, and my daughter has studied from the West. And I have produced a documentary. So if you go and click on the YouTube, it's who cares if Bangladesh drowns? That's the basic position. Who cares if fucking 160 million people die? It doesn't matter. In international news, we do not figure. We figure only when we are killing or we are getting killed in the proportionate number which will overwhelm 130 million deaths in Paris. Otherwise, forget it. Our crisis is not being able to set our indicators for what we would think are success and what we think are failures. Our country is split between two major parts, the state part, the government part, and the social part. And the government and the social part talks less and less. So the informal and the formal sector is the most dominant division. And these are also influenced by class divisions, ethnic divisions. And one of the subjects I teach at the university is diversity. So my students can actually draw up maps and tell you who are the different people who exist. We do not pay any attention. Like, say, Chittagong Hill Tracks. Nobody paid any attention, if you look at the history of Chittagong Hill Tracks, till they picked up the gun. So history today, media today, is dominated by guns. And I don't think it will immediately change. So because whoever gets the gun gets the attention. And that plays on the anxiety that exists in the world, that I don't have a gun, therefore something else is good.
If I can bring in perhaps Garga.
Thank you.
Garga, you've written a review of Blood Telegram, but one of the interesting things you brought up in your review, which is in this issue, is the role of the North and the South, and how there are sometimes only one representation which comes out in the history or in narratives. Linking it to what Afsanda is saying about a very limited representation of Bangladesh in the regional and international media. Could you comment on how you are of course a Bengali, but you are not a Bangladeshi, so you have a very interesting inside-outsider perspective. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. And at the cost of starting with quoting Jinnah, on this question. What Jinnah had once said, I mean, Jinnah was somewhat, he was an elite politician, so he was skeptical of mass politics, throughout his career. And he had something very interesting, that he is not very, he's kind of skeptical with politics because in democracy, people are not weighed, they are counted, and that's a problem. Okay? So, and therein, if you kind of push that line of argument, Bangladesh, which houses 1 in 50 human beings, by the way. Out of every 50 human beings in this world, 1 is a person living in the People's Republic of Bangladesh. So, whenever we get into the game of weighing and not counting, we are weighed down, if you will, by priorities of who own the ways of representation. Whenever we get into the ideas of who owns the ways of representation, then we come into the question of who has historically owned the ways of representation, what do we know as ways of representation, where exactly do we want to be represented so that it counts as representation, all of that, right? So, and we live in the long shadow of exactly that regime. You can call it colonialism, the long shadow of it. You could call it neo-colonialism. The names don't really matter. What matters is numbers don't matter. And it should. Numbers should matter because numbers make humanity. Weights of human beings, how valuable human beings are, can be determined by subjective prejudices of all kinds. But numbers are kind of a stark reality which nobody can totally ignore. That's sort of, quote unquote, the international sense. Within the South Asian perspective, there's a certain problem, and I love Himal for various reasons, but one reason is that they have this beautiful cartoon. They had once a beautiful cartoon, and the cartoon goes like this. So there is one kind of a land, Danga, and then there is another kind of land mass, and in the middle there's a ravine in between. And the ravine is, and this is South Asia, this whole thing, okay? And the ravine is India-shaped. So that if you sort of get into the space of South Asia, there is this overbearing presence of the Indian Union where everything falls into. That's a problem. It's a huge problem. And it's an externality problem because the perspective from Delhi dominates, it gatekeeps in certain ways how this region will be represented. If there's a South Asian correspondent of any Western media thing, guess where it will be housed, right? So all of that is there. But additionally, with this thing, there's another problem which only a minority nationality within the Indian Union can actually articulate, somebody like me, right? So even within the Indian Union, there is a dominance of what might be, in a shorthand way called Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan, right? It's that concept which really dominates what you call, sometimes grandiosely, the idea of India, all versions of it, to the idea of South Asia. It's from that vantage, what is Bangladesh? Illegal immigrants, poverty, not being exactly, what's the word? Ungrateful for 71, etc., right? Now, which means that there is no good engagement with the evolving reality of this landmass, okay? Its own links, its own heritage, right? And it completely then doesn't take into account the links which certain parts of the Indian Union have with this area. Just yesterday, I was in Upper Assam, okay? In, what's the place? Lakhimpur area, okay? Lakhimpur is actually quite near to Sylhet. So there's something called wheat rusk, which people eat with tea. So The wheat rusk there comes from Sylhet. It's Sylhet made. So which means that there are these links, continued links, where something being made in Delhi or Mumbai, in legal ways transported, still cannot compete with the illegal smuggling which comes through the Indo-Bangladesh border. Well, the idea is that they are actually closer, which is largely the reason, right? So in a way, the representation of Bangladesh, this region, the problem is one, that too many other kinds of representators who are extremely powerful with their own agendas, number one. And secondly, numbers don't seem to matter. For example, if Western Bengal and Eastern Bengal start talking, we have 1/20th of humanity sort of talking to each other. That's a major phenomenon, right? But that's not the way in which this is looked at.
Thank you, Garga. I think, in fact, we in Himal, we really struggle with this. Our position is not a popular one. Most news and analysis stops at the border, even though there are so many interlinkages, both of challenges as well as opportunities. Your landslide might be my flood, your dam may be my inundation, your poverty may be my illegal immigration, and yet this is not something which most people are focusing on, but we have found good contributors who think beyond the national box, and we tried to get these issues together. Prashanta, I'd like to ask you, Garga was talking about the Indian ravine, but also how large parts of India itself fall within the ravine because they're not represented. And Bangladesh, of course, has had a very strong identity based on ethnicity and language through its independence struggle. And yet, there are issues related to the minority communities, which it is still grappling with. Why is a nation which was based on such ideals struggling with these issues now? Where did that change come about?
All right. I think it's the other side. Like, if you attach too much importance in numbers, I mean, if democracy is just a game of numbers, if it is a question of tyranny of 51% over 49%, I mean, that's probably not the kind of democracy the world wants or needs. Now, when it comes to Bangladesh, if you perhaps, in order to correct the problem of perhaps ignoring the numbers, the multitudes, but in Bangladesh, we have the opposite problem. You say Bangladesh is a monolingual country, monoethnic country, 99% are Bengalis. I mean, that sort of homogeneous conception of nation state, we know is a problem itself. And then 1% doesn't count. But here we are talking about, if you look at from the other side, if you think in terms of cultures, languages represented, Bangladesh is actually quite diverse as well, just like most other nation states in today's world. So this very fact that this diversity is not acknowledged, and even this idea of Bengali, Afsan Chowdhury started talking about, I was just thinking, okay, some million Bengalis died, some few hundred ago. Well, Bengalis in what sense? I mean, did it also include different ethnicities? There are issues like this. Even Bengali identity, it has multiple aspects. You have diversity of languages, dialects. It's not so much about the fact that the ethnic minorities are not taken into account in the construction of the Bangladeshi nation state, but it is the very diversity of even the Bengali population. And I think this is the thing, like I have been exposed to this concept of paradox just by coincidence recently at another conference. At Berkeley, I was at Berkeley at a conference on Bangladesh. They were also very big on this concept of paradox. I was saying to myself, if you keep hearing the same concept several times, you need to kind of worry. Maybe that's not the right issue to flag. Paradox, only if you, I mean, it is from a certain perspective, it's a paradox. To me, at Berkeley, what they were talking about was this apparent paradox between economic growth happening. Should we just wait? All right. And then you have poor governance. Actually, there is no paradox if you see in those terms. I mean, the paradox lies in the limitation of the beholder, in my opinion. So I think diversity is seeing many aspects. So I think Bangladesh is a totality that includes all contradictions, just like any other. The world today is very complex, and it's full of contradictions. If we realize that, if we take that kind of view, I don't see any paradox. I think the paradox lies in our inability to articulate reality or identities in a manner that articulates and represents the complexities, the contradictions that already exist. So I'll just end by saying, when I was being introduced, you know, one of my books, I mean, a compilation of my articles in Bangla was mentioned. I just want to talk about it to share with you the problem we have. The book, in my view, was about Bangladesh. I mean, it has issues about ethnic minorities, Adivashi, etc., but I conceived of the book, and I tried to present it as a book that examines the nation state from sort of perspectives that are not usually taken into account. But one paper, the dominant paper in Bangladesh, said, this is a book about Adivashi. There you go. I mean, to me, I was trying to examine Bangladesh, trying to see Bangladesh, present Bangladesh. This is not about just the Adivashis. So this is how I want to, like, when, like, okay, Prashanta Tripura, he has to only write about, and it so happens that my paper in this issue of Himal is about that, grabbing identity. But I mean, it's really about, I mean, our failure to have perspectives that really can accommodate and articulate the contradictions. I'll stop.
Yeah, Prashanta, I think you have an extremely interesting article in this issue exploring the whole concept of the Adivashi. And as you said, I think that the totality contains contradictions, and I hope this panel will also contain contradictions as we go along. But I'd like to ask Kasia to talk a little bit about her area of research. You've written a really interesting piece for us looking at the dimension of climate change, which is clearly a threat to this country, but how perhaps this global view of climate change is preventing a lot of local action, including on some development parameters which may be not good for this country or its climate, because everything shifts into a certain boxed paradigm of climate change. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. You know, I think that the conversation that's going on in the panel is really interesting in relation to the kinds of things that I've been exploring about climate change, and that is specifically that climate change in Bangladesh, the way that it's talked about and the role that it's playing in forging a kind of new international politics of development is an issue of representation. And a lot of that has to do with you know, like has been said, the failure to sort of allow Bangladesh to determine its own metrics and indices for what kind of development should be possible and what a vision of the future, in particular the ecological future, should look like. So climate change is clearly a threat to the coastal region of Bangladesh and to the country in general. But a lot of the problems that are being cited as issues of climate change are actually sort of ecological and social issues that have very long histories that go back to the colonial period and perhaps even prior. So questions about what is driving salinity and sea level rise and things like that in the coastal region and specifically in rural communities. Climate change subsumes conversations about shrimp farming and the failures of water engineering going back to, in particular, sort of American and Dutch engineering schemes starting in the 60s. And, you know, as Professor Iftikhar Iqbal has written about, in the colonial period, land management schemes and the way the railroads were built under the British. All of these things have contributed to the ecological and social crises that we're seeing in rural Bangladesh. And so in the sort of enthusiasm to jump on this opportunity for saying Bangladesh is vulnerable to climate change, and therefore we are, okay, we're owed reparations for that, which is something I don't disagree with, that Bangladesh is owed reparations for a lot of different kinds of colonialisms and neocolonialisms. But I think that discourse fails to capture, I mean, and I think that this is what you were saying also about climate change, and the kind of why people are enthusiastic about climate change in a particular way. I think that that we let that get in the way, possibly, of really recognizing the historical and social challenges that the region has faced. And I think, I mean, to me, you know, as I said, this is an issue of representation, and that is the Bangladesh paradox, that how should Bangladesh be represented from the outside world, how that confronts how Bangladesh chooses to represent itself. I personally think that in many ways these are issues of development and who decides, as you've said, who decides who gets to represent Bangladesh and who decides who gets to narrate this history. So I'm very excited to be in conversation with all of you because I think that these are issues that come together really well.
If you are interested in reading all these wonderful essays, the book is available in Bookworm. They've told me to flag it on a concessional rate. But to get to this issue of representation and who gets to decide, Afsan, if I can turn to you again, Bangladesh is, of course, South Asia's youngest nation and perhaps very close to its history as the start of nationhood. I'm wondering how people here deal with the fact that it is such a young nation. What is the relationship to history? As a historian, I think you've studied this a lot, and in fact your essay in our issue is on your role as a historian, which we had to get from our archives because you wanted Himal to close down and you didn't contribute to us. We hope that will change. But it's still a very relevant article even now after several years. So perhaps you could speak to it a little bit.
Thanks. No, I wanted to shut down because I wanted you to stay alive on and on. I think it is the most wonderful idea to have a magazine in an area like South Asia, which actually treats it as South Asia. I do not know what is South Asia, but I think I like the magazine and the way it has treated stories. So I said, go online. Kanak, go online. Don't try to publish this bloody thing. It's too expensive. But that was the reason I wanted it to shut down. But here is my take on the issue. Diversity is so critical, what Prashanta said, and what Garga also says. So Garga is a Bengali, and he believes in certain ways in the Bengali nation. I am very interestingly, like so many, I'm a mixed. I have a West Bengal, which is the Ghoti, and I have the Bengal identity, and they're both very prominent identities. But what I find is that one of the reasons we do not address this issue is we go into the devotional space very quickly in intellectual world. We don't want to address, we don't want to question, so we fall into the point where we say, okay, this is the given truth. So when you have given truths in the academic world, and there's a lot of given truth in the academic world, we cannot deal with it. So if I go into my class and say, okay, tell me, which is the group which suffers most in Bangladesh, and how would you identify their vulnerability? Initially, when I started this course in diversity, I don't think any other university in Bangladesh teaches this course the way we do, where we do actually measure how much people suffer and under which category. Of course, you know, the Adivashis came out first, and the Hindus came out second. And I said, okay, what are your indicators? And this went on and on till they started to look at and said, by indicators, is the poor who suffer the most. So if you have a denial parameter, you'll be surprised that the 25 to 30% of the population suffers the maximum. If you have multiple identities, and we all have multiple identities, so if you are a poor Adivasi, your goose is nearly cooked. If you are poor Hindu Adivasi, then you have very little chance. If you're a poor Hindu Adivasi woman, don't even think about doing anything. And if you're poor Hindu Adivasi disabled, you're really badly off. And then if you have all these categories, plus if you're elderly, then you don't have a chance. But we need to address this. Instead of doing that, we are falling into the nation-state identities and insisting that we already have the truth. Say, for example, our narrative on 1971. You cannot even move from what is cited as evidence, because if you do, you'll be perceived as a traitor, like I am perceived as a traitor. And I had to write this in a paper. And as a collateral consequence of that, I was taken to the court. But that's another matter. But the point is this. Academics have, and intellectuals have abdicated their responsibility. They have not questioned the obvious. And as academics, we should question why we think they're obvious. Well, of course, nation building. But for whose nation did we build? I'm convinced, as a anti-Marxist, contra-Marxist, that this society is so class-driven that 1971 war was essentially for the benefit of the rich. Now it is impossible to bring this into the mainstream narrative. Because as soon as you say so, you'll say, what about the peasants and what about everyone? Well, what about them? Nobody did anything for them. Who are the direct beneficiaries of 1972? It's the rich. So when you produce a country for the rich, then obviously the rich will benefit. And our paradigm, our scheme of things are such that it's almost impossible to develop societies which are egalitarian, which are equitable, not to speak of equal. Given that, do we explore history? I believe we don't. And that is the problem. Thank you.
I'd now like to throw open this to the audience. As Afsan said, the obvious should be questioned, and I hope you'll have some stimulating questions for our panelists. We have a very short time, unfortunately. This session got a bit truncated because of various hartal, etc. issues. But if you can ask precise questions, no comments at the moment, please. Excuse me, can you circulate the mic?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, yes. My name is Iqbal Ahmed. I'm an independent researcher on child labor. I just want to ask a question, but before I get to the question, just quickly give you a context, the things that you've been talking about. I know you talked about a lot of representation of Bangladesh. Also, you contextualize how news is perceived. But in terms of development, the Robert Chambers, I'm sure you're all aware of Robert Chambers at IDS. He mentioned if we want to change ourselves, I mean, we need to change.
We really won't have time for
yes.
anybody else if you don't ask your question.
I'm just going to ask a question.
Please,
So he
please
says,
do. Please ask your question.
okay, my question is, what would it take us as a nation to become self-critical to continue to move forward?
Is your question addressed to anyone specific?
Anyone can answer. I mean, Ahsan Bhai or anyone can take it a shot.
Prashanta, would you like to?
I think in order to be self-critical, we need to define what self is. And the diversity of self, that I think would take care of it. Thank you.
Any other questions? No questions. I can't believe this audience has been sleeping. Yes.
I would like to add a little bit to that answer, not exactly responding to Prashanta, but so I also speak as a minority people in my nation-state context. So I am in sympathy with exactly what you're talking. Maybe a number in crores, but again, numbers don't matter. Percentages do in a majoritarian democratic context. So when we are talking about equal stakeholdership, the idea is also to move from, nation statehood models to models of stakeholdership of peoples, again, with somewhat osmotic borders, right, of people's identities. Because the question of majority is a vexing one. I'm a majority in terms of religion in my nation state. I'm a minority in terms of my linguistic identity in my nation state. So, it's kind of tricky. At the same time, then, how do we ensure justice? The idea of justice, I think, in such contexts as ours, in the South Asian region, where we do not have, Germany's or things like that, one man, one race, one language, more or less, is that we need to break down majorities under various angles and ruses even. It's important to put the spanner. It's important to rip apart majorities. It's important to complicate majorities. That's only when we have deepening of democracy. Democracy is not we have more than you. When I meant numbers matter, I meant numbers in terms of representation. One person's voice, if there is something like a global marketplace or a town hall, there's no such thing, then 5 people's voices cannot be heard less than one white person's voice. That's the spirit I was coming from. And this is the other thing I'm talking when I'm talking quote unquote internally. Okay.
One last question, because I'm told that we are running out of time. That gentleman's hand was up first. And brief question, please, because somebody's glaring at me from the sidelines.
Thank you. I'm Muzammal Hussain, a retired government officer. My humble question to Mr. Afsan sir, as you said that 71 was the beneficiaries for the richest, as I do understand that I have seen Liberation War, that 71 cropped up for our political emancipation, economic emancipation, all fears of people. They fought to get their political right and they rose up. And it included all caste, creed, and religions, other than a few sections that is from the southern part who were not in line with the mainstream of the Bengalis. Sir, thank you.
I'll just give me a point. Thank you very much. That was not the point I was making. I'm saying that the war was led by a certain group of people. Everyone participated, the certain group benefited. And for that, you have to look at national economic data. That's how it's there. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm afraid we've completely run out of time. We're probably the only session today to be on time. This does not do justice to our very interesting speakers, but I hope this is the beginning of many conversations rather than the end of one. Thank you so much for being here.